Hello and welcome to FactCheckNI's panel discussion as part of this year's virtual Global Fact 7 conference of fact checkers around the world. Thank you very much for joining us. I am Allan Leonard, a co-founder and editor of FactCheckNI, Northern Ireland's first and only dedicated fact-checking service. FactCheckNI works to foster a culture of critical thinking within a deeply divided society through our fact checks, explainer articles, how-to guides, and training in schools and local community environments. We are also engaged with media literacy campaigns and research projects, such as a partnership with Stockholm University in a European Commission research project called Co-Inform, with its hashtag ThinkCheckShare. Today, we're here to discuss another type of partnership. We wish to share our experiences in Northern Ireland with journalists and statisticians and data scientists. This will be a conversation with an esteemed journalist and an accomplished statistician, discussing the importance of data and how it is used in telling news and stories. We hope you'll gain an appreciation of the importance of the integrity of trustworthy official data sources and the benefits that that offers for good working relationships with fact-checking organizations. So today we are joined by John Campbell, who is an economics and business editor at BBC Northern Ireland, and Niall O'Neill, a statistician with the Northern Ireland Statistics and Research Agency, or NISRA for short. So I have a few questions for our guests before we open the discussion to our audience. So, John, you're very welcome. And could you— Good morning, John. Could you start us off by telling us how you got involved with numbers and data? So essentially, why do you like data and what is your continuing interest?
Well, I have actually no formal training in stats or data science at all. I am a journalism graduate from the University of Sheffield, although I do come from a very numerate family. My dad is a maths teacher. One of my sisters has a PhD in theoretical physics and works as an actuary. So she always finds it terribly amusing that I am considered to be the numbers guy in BBC Northern Ireland when I barely scratch the surface compared to what she knows. But I suppose my interest in business and economics news goes right back to when I was an undergraduate in Sheffield, because I remember at the time I was studying the hedge fund long-term capital management was blowing up. And it was just fascinating to me as to, what is this thing? How's it gone wrong? This all seems very important. Why did so few people seem to know about it? And why is it so difficult to explain? So I got a bit of a taste for it then. And then when I started my career at the Liverpool Daily Post and Echo, as a trainee, I worked for a time on the business desk of the Daily Post there. And then you start to become more familiar just with the importance of economic data, where you get the numbers from, what the numbers are, what they actually tell you. And then when I moved on to BBC Northern Ireland, I had various mainly production jobs there. And then I think it was probably around the time of the great financial crisis, I was working in News Online. And again, I was just realizing, well, something very significant is happening here. This seems fascinating. How do we explain this? And there was just this wealth of data and material available to us. And then whenever I became the economics and business editor, more than 5 years ago now, I suppose those data sources just became a part of my everyday working life, mainly from Niall's organization, NISRA, also from the Office for National Statistics, from Eurostat in the EU, and from CSO in the Republic of Ireland. So it's a vital part of my work. Virtually every day I will be using some of these data sources to try and tell stories. And I suppose, in terms of how important it is, it's absolutely vital, because if you in some ways, and I'm assuming we all do, I still have some sort of belief in an objective reality which we can tell people about, then having good statistical data is absolutely vital to what we do.
Yes, very good. So now, John referenced NISRA there. So can you explain to us kind of how your interest in data came from.
Yeah, sure. Good morning, everyone. And John, we've got something in common. My father was a maths teacher as well. I guess in terms of my academic background, I have a degree in economics and a master's degree in business administration. And around 10 years ago as well, I completed a qualification in newspaper journalism. So I've worked for NISRA for 22 very, very, very long years. I started back in '98 in an operational research role, looking at pay and personnel statistics. And that provided a great grounding for developing the professional and technical skills required for a role as a statistician. It wasn't particularly high profile statistics, very little coverage, if any, in the media. I then moved on to work in the area of criminal justice statistics. And I think that was the time I really began to fully appreciate the power of data and statistics in society. I was working on a wide range of criminal justice statistics, from statistics related to deaths in the Troubles and various incidents in the Troubles, to stop and search statistics, police, public levels of satisfaction with police, to drug seizures, a whole wide range of statistics that were achieving a very high profile in the media and were of vital importance to policy colleagues within a range of areas. And in recent years then I moved on. I was about 10 or 11 years in the criminal justice area. Then moved on to the area of societal well-being and statistical indicators to inform societal well-being. And that's really about the drive to move beyond a headline economic indicator such as gross domestic product, and consider statistical indicators from across society, across areas of life, when we're considering how we're performing as a society. So you'd be looking at indicators within health, education, our own personal well-being, the environment. And that's been great, for me, because that's allowed me to collaborate with statisticians from across our agency to understand the statistics in which they are really the experts. And my latest role has been in the area of economic and labour market statistics, and that sort of brings me full circle back to my years at university, but typically I've forgotten quite a lot in those 22 years.
Very good. So John, Niall there was mentioning some, hinting at some of the kind of products that are out there. Could you answer us sort of how you yourself analyze and use data to tell news and stories, maybe with some examples and explaining, the importance of data in your day-to-day work? Yeah,
well, I suppose the way I sometimes express it is when it comes to those economic statistics, for our viewers and listeners, the question they're really asking themselves is, are we winning or losing personally? Are we winning or losing as a society? In other words, are things getting better or are things getting worse? And in some respects, there are some stats which are quite easy to get that idea from, such as unemployment. So unemployment going up, bad for people. Unemployment coming down, it's good. Wages statistics, people can think, well, wages are going up, are my wages going up, am I winning or losing? So it's that sense of appealing to people on that level. So I suppose when you're working with statistics for especially TV, I'd say that there's a couple of things around that. One is, in the context of a TV package, you have to be very sparing on what you're actually doing in terms of numbers. You have to be very much concentrated on telling one story, because as ever, if you have a graphic or an explainer in a newspaper or a magazine or online, people can take a bit of time over it. They can go back and read it again. In TV, it appears once, and they've got to absorb that knowledge once. So usually, I would really only want, I think, one or two graphics or data viz within the context of the piece, and try and make them kind of pretty easy to grasp. It's usually green arrow up, red arrow down type stuff. It has to be that simple. And also, you need to as best you can, move from the kind of the abstract statistic to a real life person or event, to kind of, I think, to give it kind of greater salience to the audience. So for example, when we were, so one kind of recent set of statistics we have is on furloughed workers. And clearly that's become a big thing. There's lots of them, and particularly among young people. So the number one thing challenge for me is not getting the stats, because they are provided in this case by HMRC. The challenge was finding the person who is one of those statistics. So I managed to get this woman in Bangor who works in hospitality, and was able to go out and talk to her about her experience of furlough to bring the statistic actually to life. And it's very often what can be effective, I think, and probably what's not done enough, is to present statistics in the long run, because very often on a quarter-to-quarter basis, or even on an annual basis, the kind of movements that you see are actually pretty small. So they're not very dramatic. So, but sometimes if you show a data series over the long run, you get a much better sense of what this statistic means for society. So, the one I very often come back to is the story of Northern Ireland house prices and the kind of the crazy boom and bust situation here in the last decade, where I think between 2005 and 2007, house prices doubled just in 2 years, and then collapsed almost as quickly. Whereas if you just use the most recent data, all you see is this very kind of shallow, gradual recovery from 2013 until now. But I still feel that in order to kind of really tell the story of the long run impact on our economy, you need to go right back to that earlier part of the time series. And I think another important thing around statistics, especially when I'm trying to talk about them on air or even talking to my colleagues about them in the newsroom about whether they're significant or not, is to explain to people that in most cases we are dealing with estimates. Now, they're pretty good estimates most of the time, national statistics. But whenever I report them, I usually say new official figures suggest rather than show, because we know that even some very, very important statistics like GDP is subject to several revisions. And in fact, we only really get a true GDP figure years after the event. So I think that's one of the important things, again, I try to communicate, both in the newsroom and on air, is there's a degree of uncertainty around some of these figures. And another one I'll give an example of, and Niall may be familiar with, is tourism statistics. It's actually quite difficult to define what a tourist is statistically. And particularly on a quarter-to-quarter basis, when we're looking at tourism, the error bars, the margin of error is massive, it's huge. So I would never be in a position, I think, where I would ever want to be comparing quarter-to-quarter in tourism statistics. It's more like you need to be at least comparing year-to-year, or preferably just talking about a much longer-term trend. So there is also that sense of, also I think, hopefully coming across in that as you work with statistics over a period of time, you get a feel for the outline of those numbers, where the weaknesses are, where the strengths are, even how those numbers are collected, and the degree of uncertainty or certainty that you should be expressing when you're talking about them. And I think that's very important, because although, as I said, they help us represent an objective reality, there is uncertainty there. As another example, when we're talking about understanding about how the statistics are gathering and what they're measuring, we can look at unemployment again. So recently, we've known that unemployment clearly is going up as a result of this crisis, but in the labour force survey, which is what we normally use, we haven't really been using it to tell that story, because the time period in which that data was collected is before the crisis. So it's almost like a statistical artifact now. So instead we used another series, was the claimant count, which generally we don't use quite so much because it's more up to date. But with explaining those caveats, which is there's a trade-off here, this is maybe not the most accurate data, there are certain wrinkles in it, but it's the most up to date. And I think another one which around labour market statistics, which has become, it's almost been a Twitter phenomenon in recent years, which is when you use the labour force survey, it uses an international model, the ILO, International Labour Organization. They use a common kind of way of working it out across the world, basically. And the ILO say you're counted if employed if you've done 1 hour's work in the week during the reference period. So various people have read into this, and then on Twitter, every time you put the unemployment figures out, they say, aha, those figures are fake because they're only counting people working 1 hour a week. But then you have to say, well, yeah, how many people do you know are working 1 hour a week? In what kind of business organization does it make any sense to have somebody working 1 hour a week? So then you have to go and reference another set of data, which looks at hours worked in both the UK and Northern Ireland, and you can show, right, if the growth in jobs was all about people working 1 hour a week, we would see that showing up in the number of people who are working very low hours, but that line is flat. So yes, there are certain quirks within how the labour force survey works, but it's not the case that jobs growth is fake because of this particular kind of measurement technique. So you can see that you have to, as you work with data, be aware of what exactly is being measured, what's not being measured, where the uncertainties are, and how best to explain that to an audience.
Thank you very much, John. I'm smiling all the way here because I hear you loud and clear. At FactCheckNI, we developed an early relationship and appreciation of statistics, official statistics, and statistics agencies. And we have benefited from it because, just as you have outlined there with labor data, there's been plenty of claims that we have had to investigate where we've had to do a little diving into data. Sometimes we were able to figure it out ourselves, many times we weren't. And that's where we were so grateful to be able to call upon our friends at NISRA and elsewhere. And it reminds me of an event that NISRA had organized in Belfast with the Office of Statistics Regulations, speaking about their code of principles and transparency. Very, very familiar to the code of principles that we fact-checking organizations sign up to at IFCN. And in that discussion, there was a remark about how journalists had reported on homelessness, but hadn't quite got the reportage right. And my colleague and another co-founder, Orna Young, and I were in that room, and we're like, did we get that right? And so we were quickly looking at our fact check, and we expressed a sigh of relief. We're like, yes, we actually looked at the right data. But the point that was being made at the conference was the need, and appreciation from the statistics agencies to have some type of dialogue with journalists, so journalists do know which data they should be looking at. And so that then leads nicely to asking Niall the same question in regards about the data products that they create and how they present them to their audiences. So Niall, if you could answer that and perhaps give us some examples of the work that you've been involved in.
Well, sure, Alan. NISRA statisticians work with data on a wide range of areas of society, and we'll be trying to tell the story of those data that's meaningful to all of our users, whether it's those setting government policy, academia, the media, and the general public, obviously. So if I do give you a couple of examples of my recent work, and I suppose a few years ago, NISRA got a new chief executive, Siobhan Carey, and she recognized the lack of a central state of the nation style presentation to explain Northern Ireland at large and how it's changed over time. John mentioned there about the importance of a long time series, and that's one of the things that we considered when putting this together. So I was asked to work on that, and I developed a resource pack called NIN Profile. And that presents data across about 17 different areas of society. So it'll include the likes of housing, the economy, welfare, technology, the environment, travel and transport, so a whole range of different areas. And the idea was to create a single resource that anyone interested in life in Northern Ireland could go to and get an understanding of the key stories in any or all of those areas. And although there are headlines and a few key points, there's very little text throughout, so it's meant to be easily digestible to the public at large. It relies heavily on charts to help tell the story of the data, and I think that again something that aligns with John. You know, John will be looking for an image, certainly looking for a voice, and looking for a person to help illustrate the story on the back of data. And that's something we as statisticians have moved towards doing a lot more and got a lot better actually at doing. That's using a visual or a chart to help tell that story. And that can tell a story much more than a page of text. You only need to look at the likes of the Financial Times and John Murdoch and Alan Smith there, and they've invested really heavily in their data visualization and through social media have obtained a massive following for their work in the recent pandemic. Mm-hmm. But getting back to NN Profile, it's been really very well received by our users. And one of the key things that they appreciate is that throughout the report, there are links to sources to allow them to drill down further into an area. You know, we collaborated with the statisticians who are the experts in their particular area, and they suggest what the key indicators are in their area. But by providing those links, it allows a user to then access the data specifically on those charts that they see, but also to drill down and try and further understand more indicators and get a broader story if they so wish. But we've got to acknowledge that a lot of people don't need that. The general public at large just want what's the key message in those areas. And the longer time series you've got in there, the better. So we have gone back as far as we can in all those instances.
Yes, Niall, just to say, I like how I've highlighted in the red box there the links to further statistics. So if you want to go into deeper waters, as I like to say, the links are right there. And so on one of the previous slides, it showed an infographic, and that was produced by NISRA itself, and I got access to it just from the EU exit slide, EU people movement and migration. And again, at FactCheckNI, we've used this data in answering claims about, what is migration in Northern Ireland, net migration, what is north-south daily crossings, what percentage of trade from Northern Ireland goes to GB, the Republic of Ireland, the rest of the EU. These are claims that are made, and whether we answer them in a fact check or an explainer article, having easy and kind of straightforward access to the data really helps us out very much.
Yeah, and that's something we are working towards in NISRA to do a lot more of. For example, in the economic and labour market side, which I work now, there is a drive to try and put a story of the economy together. It's John will know, it's once you get drilled down into the data, it's fairly complex, and there's a lot of limitations with it, and you can lose sight of the economy in general or in its entirety and all the facets of it. So trying to get one slide pack, as a lot of statisticians are now putting together, with a key message of all of those areas to draw everything together is something that's important in NISRA at the minute. But not losing sight as well of the detail that you need to put out there. There's limitations, as John mentioned, to all of these data. And that's as important as a statistician to convey to the public as well. That all statistics are an estimate, and they're higher or lower quality estimate to some extent. And we need to tell users exactly what they can and can't conclude from those statistics. So that's something that we don't lose sight of. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's important because we're looking at the slide of health there. And on one hand, like John was saying about long-term series, that's an important statistic there because it could be something that people just don't know about, the fact that the gender gap has been closing over the years. So whereas any individual year's data may not be newsworthy, it could be part of a larger story. But of course, health then reminds us of why we are conducting this virtually today, and that of course is the pandemic. And I'm sure, I know that it has caused challenges for all of us, but for you folk at NISRA especially so. So could you describe sort of how it has affected your organization and what your response has been?
Well, sure. Over the last few months, I've been working with a small but really dedicated and brilliant team responsible for providing statistics on registered COVID-19 deaths. Obviously, the statistics are tragic, but it's really highlighted for me, anyway, the importance of providing reliable, easily understandable data to inform society and the impact of the pandemic in Northern Ireland. I guess the team has developed a weekly bulletin and accompanying online dashboard to present the data, and working with media remains central to that work. And the team have done a really, selfishly saying, but I think the team have done a really excellent job in that respect. They've held weekly press briefings on the morning that the statistics are released, and I think given the importance of the area, I think up to 40 journalists attended one of those press briefings, and they did all they could to try and explain the data and their limitations. And certainly the BBC took that on board, and they have done some excellent work. Kevin McGee, they're trying to explain every week that these statistics come out, help explain what these data mean and the issues with the data, and what you can and can't conclude from them. You know, Alan, I'm always surprised by how what you would think is a simple, easily presented and easily understood number proves quite complex to explain. You know, but before all this, you wouldn't have given it too much thought. You would have just said that just count the number of deaths. But then you need to understand: is the COVID-19 death, has that person been tested? Were they tested and achieved a positive test? You're talking about death registration statistics. When were those deaths registered? How long ago did the death actually occur? Do you need to build that into your reporting? Where did the death occur? Is a big focus on care home deaths or deaths in hospital. How did they differ from Department of Health statistics? And you need to explain that. So there's never, as a statistician, there's never a very straightforward one line that you can provide, and you're always trying to provide the context.
If I can come in a second here as well, it did take, I think, us as the media and reporters just to come to terms and grapple with exactly what we were describing with some of that data. The difference between the NISRA figures, the Department of Health figures, which were hospital deaths, and then also the excess mortality over the 5-year average. So, we were effectively having to tell people about 3 different sets of stats, and it just took us a little while to get the correct language there to express what exactly was going on. But I would also say that I think it was an important step forward from NISRA as well, those on-the-day briefings when the data came out, where it wasn't just left to the journalists, many of whom had no real experience of working with stats, to just try and get on with it and work it out for themselves. But they were kind of stepping people through what was being measured, what wasn't being measured, and how best to describe it, which was kind of a model for how things could work with other data series as well, because there are other figures we get which sometimes are quite complicated. For example, poverty figures, when we're talking about absolute and relative deprivation, and it would be useful to get briefings on those types of data series which have their own quirks as well.
Yes, that's absolutely, John. I mean, there is always the risk, and maybe why many are adverse to exploring data is because it potentially can be blinding, just too much numbers and science. And yet this pandemic crisis has shown, at least here in Northern Ireland, some cooperation between the statisticians and the journalists and fact checkers. We've done some, we've worked very hard, like yourselves, John, to try to explain what these figures mean. And it's not easy, and that's the challenge for us fact checkers and journalists is to try to distill and synthesize all of this complexity in a friendly way. But Niall, this isn't the first time really that NISRA and ONS and others have kind of collaborated with journalists. There was last December's general election in the UK. Can you tell us a little bit about that and both what you know in England and then how it was applied here in Northern Ireland?
Yes, so the Government Statistical Service, which comprises the ONS in the UK and then Scotland and Northern Ireland as well, there's a scheme that they had been running for a couple of elections, a couple of general elections, where they would offer the services of a statistician to media outlets. Now it hadn't been done in Northern Ireland before, but it was opened up to Northern Ireland this year, and I was lucky enough to go to the BBC for a 3-week period leading up to the general election in December last year, and it was really to try and help if fact checking was needed of manifestos, but really to work with journalists to try and explain statistics, and also for me to learn exactly how journalists in the media would use data or do use data, and how we could improve that relationship in the future. So it was a 3-week lead up to the election day. I think one of the things that I did when I was there was that I'd sourced and collected a lot of data for each of the 18 constituencies, general election constituencies in Northern Ireland, demographics, education and health statistics, and just put them all together in one place for reporters, so that when they were on the ground on the day or in the run-up to the general election, that they got a bit of an understanding of the statistics and the story of data within those specific constituencies. There was a bit of fact checking of election manifestos, but not a lot. The politicians here tended to not include too much data within their manifestos.
Yeah. Don't tend to be big statistical claims in Northern Ireland politics. We tend not to fight elections on the basis of GDP or crime figures or anything like that.
No, not at all.
But in the political party's defense, numbers and claims do appear, and I will let it be known that FactCheckNI, we did fact check a numeric claim in each of the party's manifestos.
Yeah, so there wasn't much help that I could provide there. So I did take the time and go help out where I could, and sort of stories of the day that were ongoing. So there was a whole range of areas where I was able to direct journalists to source data that they could use within their articles. So there was like health waiting lists or suicide, an issue, an article on loneliness, household recycling, again, death and the troubles never goes away in the local media. But I think one of the things that reminded me was that once statistical organizations find it very difficult, and it's a very difficult thing to do, to get a website right, given the volume of data, the range of data, it's nearly an impossible task to put something in place that people can easily access exactly what it is they need, because there's so much there. So just I think just me being there, trying to direct people to the right place on our website or on ONS's website where they could source data was probably of use. The other thing that came out of it was that I worked with one of the data journalists there, and we put together a Northern Ireland numbers piece. It was off the back of NM profile, but it was called The Changing Face of Northern Ireland. And that was really interesting for me, because it was able to take some of the key statistics from a range of areas, but then the correspondents like John, or the health correspondent, the environment correspondent got involved, and they gave their take on what those numbers were really telling us, sort of turn of the year type piece. And the readership that got, I think it got about 75,000 reads, and that's beyond anything any publication that NISRA would ever put out, you know. So it's mutually beneficial, and the person at the end of the day that's benefited is the member, the public, who is learning what the key issues are in a range of areas and getting the correspondence take on it. I think my abiding memory of the placement, and it was only 3 weeks, but the speed at which John and his colleagues turned a story round, absorb the information, figure out what the story is and put it out there is amazing to me. I find it amazing. And how relaxed they all seem, that 1 minute they can be reading the article, digesting what it means, and have already thought 5 steps ahead about who they're going to put in front of the camera, and then it's there. The speed that turns around for me is something that just amazes me. Other things that I probably picked up from it, the range of experience of working with data. You've got people like John who are really good at working with data, you have others that are really good at working with data, but I think everyone would accept that the media and journalist skill set is more towards the communications side, just as the statistician's skill set more the numerate side, and maybe not so much in the communication. So as a statistician, if I think that my job's done by putting a spreadsheet out into the public domain and hoping that the general public get the message from the data that contains, I've completely lost the point, because I would rely on John or one of his colleagues knowing to go into a spreadsheet and knowing to analyze it. They simply don't have the time. So it's only by working together, I think, that we can really inform the general public. So I think that's really what I picked up from it. I think it was a good experience, certainly for me, at understanding the role of the media.
I think that point is well made about lots of generalist journalists who can be working on any sort of story on any different day of the week, not the specialists who will be focusing on one subject area all the time. For those generalists, it's just the case of, right, if I am doing a story on recycling or suicide or whatever, because the health core isn't there or the environment core isn't there, where do I actually find the data? Where do I actually find the stuff? And you know, getting an answer to that question is a big start for many people. And you're right, there is more data than ever being generated. And you know, as we start to see statistical agencies using more administrative data and commercial data, the speed at which stuff is coming at is accelerating all the time. Because you look at, say, what the ONS have done during the coronavirus pandemic, where they have started producing these short-term indicators, some of them involving like price scraping from e-commerce websites to give very, very up-to-date measures of inflation for certain goods. So the amount of data is just phenomenal now, and I think it's at least knowing where to find it is a good start for many people.
Gents, just want to finish up maybe with a kind of a last question about existing challenges. So, we're demonstrating a good relationship, but for each of you, kind of what challenges remain, and kind of what do you think we can do about it collectively? I'll start with you, John.
I suppose one thing, just in terms of training, is statistical literacy among people who are journalists or becoming journalists, and the BBC has improved that somewhat in recent years, where there's a lot more training, a lot more emphasis on statistics, and hopefully you will never see any kind of dodgy survey type stories anymore. So I think everybody in the newsroom now knows if a survey has been pitched to them, you will at least ask, what is the sample size? How many people were sampled in Northern Ireland? And can you show me the questions they were asked? And if the person pitching the survey can't answer those questions, then it goes no further. And just also some of the, being able to ask yourself, okay, this sounds like a big number, but is it really a big number? And I think even the More or Less and Tim Harford and that team have done a great job, not within the BBC and without. We also have a head of statistics now, Robert Cuff, who's there, if you like, just always making sure he's floating around the website and kind of catching any stuff which hopefully shouldn't be there. I think the other challenge from my point of view is the communication with the statisticians. So you get any statistical release from NISRA, and at the bottom of it, it tells you who the responsible statistician is, and a phone number. You can just ring them up and say, right, I'm not quite sure about this. Can you point me in the right direction? Now, if I'm just any random member of the public, I can ring up the responsible statistician and ask them that question. However, if you're a journalist, you have to go through usually the Department of Finance press office. So you have this kind of farrago where you need to ask a question about a technical statistical question through a third party who might not know what you're really asking about, and then you have to construct it into an email, and they send it, you send it to them, and then they send it to the statistician, and the statistician sends it back through them. Whereas, why can't I just like pick up the phone and say, see this kind of table on page 13D, am I reading this right? There's I do not see what the potential reputational damage to the Northern Ireland Executive would be by me just picking up a phone to a statistician. But there we go.
I appreciate that, John. Those points you made about just the basics about survey, it's true for all fact checkers. I think any fact checker who's looking at it could be an official statistic, but it could very well be an NGO's report on their own research. As we always say, it's good to have a healthy skepticism and just understanding the basics. A lot of times we'll get things where people will extrapolate a finding that's valid for, say, England and the UK as a whole, but apply it to Northern Ireland, where basic statistics tell you that the sample size isn't big enough. So things like that. And in regards to access, yes, so transparency is very important. So in our fact checks, we allow people to kind of see where we got the source of information from. It has to be published. So sometimes it can be frustrating if you're speaking to someone and they can kind of give you kind of what they think it is, but if it's not public information, then we can't use it. So I'm just sharing some of our challenges as well with working with data. So Niall, what about you? Any frustrations? Are enough people reading the guidance notes and limitations?
Nobody ever reads the footnotes. Nobody reads the footnotes.
I read the footnotes.
You're not off this world. So I think it is about the detail that goes alongside, not just the headline key points that you can only do in a very short piece or an instant piece that the likes of John would be doing. And I think we'd need to explore between both organisations or other media organisations. I know the BBC have these long reads, or they have more in-depth articles, and that opens up an avenue for collaboration. I think, that you could pick an area where even it doesn't need to be new statistics. There's so much out there. It's all looking at the published statistics and really drilling down into them, and then understanding the limitations, conveying the limitations, but then illustrating those by what John and his colleagues do so well, by getting people in and putting a face to a story. And here's exactly what the face behind that one number has gone through. So I think there should be scope for more collaborative working to really put those type of pieces together to educate the public. And obviously from a NISRA statistician perspective, the readership that gets for your statistic and the value then you ascribe to your work, it just goes way up, It's above my pay grade to answer John's point on the press office. I understand the difficulties, especially the tight turnaround that he's got. I certainly on the side of NISRA, we have in recent years been offering towards media the opportunity for them to join user groups for particular statistics, so that relationships are built between the media and journalists there, just as we
like I say, those
user group, so
those COVID briefings by Zoom have been a very welcome development, and like I say, hopefully might be a template for other data series in the future. Because even just if for on a say a day of quarterly employment survey, it's going to take me too much time to drive up to Stranmillis and spend an hour sitting about drinking tea and biscuits and driving back again. But if I could just do a Zoom, say at 10 o'clock, it'd be great. It would kind of contextualize the whole thing for us. We take 15 minutes, half an hour, be great.
Yeah. And
Niall,
yep.
Can you tell, but before I forget, can you just elaborate a little bit on those user groups? Because, for our listeners, how does it actually happen? I mean, what is the format? Who convenes it? Is there, this practical information?
John's already used the term responsible statistician, which is an awful term, but every person, every statistician who puts out a release is responsible for the statistic. It's part of their work as an official statistician and to adhere to the code of practice to inform users and keep users up to date. And one of the things that a statistician or group of statisticians will do will be to form a user group to keep them informed. They may well meet, they may well just correspond by email. But there's, for example, an economic statistics user group and a whole range of interested parties from media, academia, from people in the private sector as well, sit on those user groups, and they'll be told about the developments with statistics. Economic statistics moves quite rapidly and get developed, and there's a lot of detail and limitations and things to consider behind them. So it's keeping users informed of progress in certain areas. So anybody, you contact the responsible statistician. They usually include within the reports, if you want to be part of the economic statistics or whatever user group, please contact us and you'll be welcome. Because feedback, as a statistician, feedback is what helps you develop your product. You want it to be meaningful for all users, and unless you get that feedback, there's no way of doing that.
That's great. Well, listen, we've got a few minutes left, and so I'd like to take some questions. Feel free, we invite you. Maybe we've painted too rosy of a picture of our lovely garden here. I do want to hear some perspectives from any of you. What's the environment like in your area? Is this pie in the sky, or is there something you want to ask either Niall or John from various perspectives? So if you can just either in the Q&A in the box or chat, but I know that from my experience and speaking to fact checkers in other parts of the world, this is aspirational. Because there is the question of the integrity of the agency itself. There's the accusations of political corruption of the agency. So, so that's obviously a responsibility of government. And there's that challenge role by civic society and others. But then there's also, I've heard positive stories too in regards to collaboration with agencies in parts of Africa. So I know it's a varied experience. We just wanted to kind of show kind of our experience. So feel free, but if I am not getting any takers, I will just ask John and Niall if they have any practical suggestions, if they can think maybe outside Northern Ireland, about any advice, or maybe from both, say, a journalistic perspective, fact-checking perspective, and as a statistician, if you're in a place, if we believe in this collaboration and there are parts of the world where this isn't happening, let's try to give some people some aspiration about how they might be able to achieve this. So, John?
I suppose one thing is, if you look at regionally gathered statistics, so for example, you have Eurostat, which covers all of the EU, and if you have international organizations which produce their own statistics, there is a way to go where you can at least start to get some solid ground, but maybe not as much depth as you want. So for example, so the IMF and the World Bank, of course, will also be great sources of statistics, and also commercial or administrative statistics as well. So, for example, one very commonly used leading economic indicator are the PMIs, the Purchasing Managers Indicators. So they're produced locally by Ulster Bank, but they work on the same formula across the world. Now, they're not giving us GDP or anything of that nature, but they're a leading indicator in where the economy is going. So, but they tend to be pretty reliable. So those are that is data which tends to be produced independently of government, and if it's working on the same template that market provide, the company that designed it, then it's pretty good. So there are those sources potentially outside your main statistical agencies if those aren't organizations which are particularly open or in some cases maybe trustworthy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. I'm really glad you made those points, because at FactCheckNI, we have ourselves used Eurostat and other international indices where we can use them. And commercially, there's a product called Statistica. Get that right? And it's important for our audience to know that the commercial access to it is a complementary benefit of being belonging to the International Fact-Checking Network. So for any of our IFCN fact-checking members out there, you know, follow that up with the Pointer Institute, and they can give you some access. So Niall, some inspiration from yourself, please.
I don't really do inspiration. I don't know. In terms of working with a statistical agency or fact checkers working with a statistical agency, I think that's important. It's maybe not being covered as much here because we're talking about statistics in the media and telling a story. But I know, and Alan, you may have some thoughts on it, the relationship between fact check organizations and the statistical agency is very important in helping to drill down and tell a story as well. You know, I know that NISRA have a good relationship with yourselves, and I think some NISRA people actually sit or advise in FactCheckNI, but that's important, you know, even from being in on the placement, the short time I was at the placement, FactCheckNI was referred to on a number of stories. You know, they background reading in preparation for a number of stories. You know, you did a great piece on the way suicide statistics are calculated, you know, and the intricacies behind that. So I think that's as important as well as collaborating between statistical agencies and the media.
Well, thank you. You're very kind, Niall. Thank you very much. But if there's some credit due, it's from the very establishment of FactCheckNI with Andy Young, the third co-founder of FactCheckNI. When we were all looking at models around the world, we quickly fell upon Full Fact, based in London, as a charitable organization, because that's how we reminded ourselves to serve a public good. And at the time, our initial funder told us to get in contact with Tracy Power, PDQ, because she had Will Moy over giving her staff a training session, and we got a hold of Will just before he caught his flight back to London. And in that conversation, he had told us about their relationship with ONS, and the fact that Tracy Power from NISRA, who is a board member now, gave us an immediate appreciation of the benefits that a good relationship with statistics agencies can have. And with that, I'd like to kind of summarize this discussion, which I've enjoyed very much. So some of the takeaways I've gotten from this is that it's, you know, having an interest in numbers is certainly useful, but there's no need for a fact checker or journalist to be an expert. What's more important is just knowing how to get the relevant data. And when you're looking at data products, as they're called, it's worth spending some time to get to know them, read those footnotes, and certainly ask the agency or the producer of the data for some general assistance. And this goes beyond agencies. I mentioned about NGOs. We, as fact checkers, will contact the NGO and ask them, you know, their research methodology. But also to demand more from the agency to present their own data in more user-friendly ways, as for example, the NIN profile, and including links for those of us who do want to dive deeper. And it's important, I would say, it's kind of the journalist fact-checking accountability role to ensure the integrity of the agency and its products. And that means the responsibility, I would say, of us challenging where we don't think it's sufficient, or if it's just too obscure and it's not clear to us. You know, we have a right to demand to be able to understand the data that's being produced in name for us. And finally, just to say that a positive working relationship I would argue, can facilitate a better reporting of facts and serve a greater public good. So I just want to finish by saying many thanks to Niall and John, as well as fact checkers in many other countries who have joined us today. You can keep up to date with fact checking in Northern Ireland by looking at FactCheckNI.org, and you'll find us on all the usual social media channels too. So again, thank you and goodbye.